the engineering record of the dynastic period does not adequately explain. And the inscriptions of Seti were the only direct epigraphic evidence used to date the structure.
The engineering record of the dynastic period does not adequately explain it, and the inscriptions of Seti were the only direct epigraphic evidence used to date the structure. Deep beneath the sands of Abydos, Egypt, there is a structure that has quietly terrified archaeologists since the moment they found it. Not because of what's inside it, but because of what it implies about everything we think we know about ancient civilization. The engineers who first studied it in 1914 walked away with more questions than answers. The geologists who examined it decades later said the weathering patterns made no sense. And the stonework, the sheer impossible stonework, has left modern construction experts standing in silence, doing the math in their heads and coming up short. This is the Osireion, and the deeper you look, the worse it gets. Hi, my name is Matthew, and this is Reef Discovery, where we pull back the curtain on the discoveries that mainstream history would rather you find boring. Trust me, this one is anything but. What is the Osireion? Let's start with the basics, because the physical reality of this structure is the foundation of every argument that follows. The Osireion was discovered in 1914 by the British archaeologist Margaret Murray, working under the direction of Flinders Petrie, who was one of the most respected Egyptologists of his generation. Murray and her team were excavating near the Temple of Seti at Abydos when they began to uncover something unexpected beneath the desert floor. Not adjacent to the temple, not near it, but beneath it. Buried under meters of accumulated sand and debris, they found a massive stone structure that had been completely swallowed by the earth. What they uncovered was a rectangular hall built from enormous blocks of red granite and limestone. The central platform of the structure is surrounded by a channel designed to be filled with water, essentially creating an island of stone in the middle of a flooded chamber. The walls are made from granite blocks that are, and I want you to really sit with this number, some of them weigh over 100 tons each. Not 10 tons, not 25 tons, 100 tons. Individual stones. Each one, the ceiling or what remains of it, involved roofing stones of comparable weight. The construction uses no mortar, no adhesive of any kind. The blocks are fitted together with a precision that is, by any honest measurement, extraordinary. When you run your hand along the joints between blocks, and some researchers have done exactly this, you cannot fit a sheet of paper between them. There are no decorative carvings on the core structure, no inscriptions on the walls, no reliefs, no painted scenes of gods or pharaohs or the afterlife. For context, ancient Egyptians put inscriptions on practically everything. Temple walls, tomb ceilings, the sides of obelisks, the bases of statues. The absence of decoration is not a minor detail. It is profoundly strange. It suggests either that the structure was never finished, or that whoever built the core of it had no interest in decoration at all, which points toward an entirely different culture and an entirely different era. The first red flag, it's underground. Here is something that sounds simple, but becomes more disturbing the longer you think about it. The Osireion is not built on the surface of the ground. It is not even built at ground level. It is built approximately 9 to 10 meters below the surrounding terrain. And in Abydos, that means something very specific and very problematic. The water table at Abydos is high. It has always been high, given the proximity to the Nile floodplain. Building a massive stone structure 9 meters below the surface in this location means building below the water table, which means the structure floods, which means it has always flooded, which means from a purely practical standpoint that anyone choosing to build here was choosing to build a chamber that would be permanently, inescapably full of water. Now, there are two ways to interpret this. The first interpretation, the mainstream one, is that the flooding was intentional, that the structure was designed as a symbolic representation of the primordial waters of creation in Egyptian cosmology. The waters that existed before the gods shaped the world. Under this interpretation, the flooding is a feature, not a bug. And honestly, that interpretation is not unreasonable. Egyptian religious architecture is full of symbolic gestures on a monumental scale. These were people who aligned entire temples with the movements of specific stars. They were absolutely capable of deciding that a sacred building should sit in water because water carried theological meaning. But here is the problem with that interpretation. Actually, here are several problems, because this structure is generous with its problems. If you are deliberately building below the water table for symbolic reasons, you are choosing to make your construction project dramatically, almost absurdly, more difficult. The ancient Egyptians did not have pumps. They did not have waterproof concrete. Managing groundwater intrusion while cutting, transporting, and placing 100-ton granite blocks from quarries hundreds of kilometers away would require a level of engineering competence and project organization that far exceeds anything we normally credit to the dynastic period in which the Osireion was supposedly built. And then there is the second problem, the depth itself. If Seti I, the new kingdom pharaoh to whom the structure is officially attributed, built the Osireion around 1300 BCE, why does it sit so far below the level of his own adjacent temple? The Temple of Seti is a surface structure built at ground level, like virtually every other Egyptian temple. The Osireion is buried beside it 9 meters down, as if it was already ancient when Seti built his temple overhead, as if Seti did not build beside the Osireion, as if Seti built his temple on top of something that was already there. The construction problem nobody can solve. Let's talk about the stones, because this is where the conversation stops being philosophical and becomes an engineering problem with no satisfying answer. The granite used in the Osireion is not local stone. The nearest source of granite matching the type used in the structure is Aswan, which is approximately 200 kilometers to the south. 200 kilometers of desert, rough terrain, and Nile navigation, and somehow individual blocks weighing up to 100 tons were transported from that quarry to this site and placed with millimeter precision. For comparison, the famous trilithon stones at Baalbek in Lebanon, which are considered among the most impressive megalithic construction feats in the ancient world, and which have baffled engineers for generations, weigh approximately 800 to 1,000 tons each. The Osireion blocks are smaller than that. But here is the critical context. Baalbek is considered an unsolved mystery of ancient construction. When engineers run the calculations on how those stones were moved, the numbers consistently exceed what ancient technology should have been capable of. The Osireion blocks are smaller than the Baalbek trilithons, but the construction challenge at Abydos is arguably more complex because the builders were working 9 meters underground. Think about what that actually means. You cannot use ramps in the same way you might for surface construction because you are building downward into an excavated pit. The workspace is confined, access is restricted, and you are placing 100-ton blocks in an area where the groundwater is actively working against you. Every modern engineer who has seriously examined this problem has arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. They do not know how it was done. Not in the general hand-wavy sense of, oh, those ancient Egyptians were clever, but in the specific, technical, load-bearing, geometrically precise sense of, we cannot reverse engineer a construction method that produces this result using tools and technology we associate with the period. And then there is the precision, because the weight of the blocks is extraordinary, but the precision is what keeps researchers up at night. The joints between blocks in the Osireion are so tight, so consistently flat and level, that they imply either a cutting technology we have not identified, or a grinding and finishing process that achieves tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter across surfaces spanning multiple meters. I want to be honest with you here, because I think this matters. Some researchers overstate this case. Not every joint in the Osireion is perfect. There is variation. There are areas of the structure that are rougher and less precise than others, which is actually an important detail we will come back to. But the core of the structure, the central chamber, the main platform, the primary wall blocks, the precision there is genuinely anomalous. It does not match what we find at confirmed New Kingdom construction sites. It matches something older, something from a tradition we do not fully understand. The stylistic problem, it doesn't belong here. Here is where things get genuinely strange, and where mainstream archaeology has the hardest time maintaining a straight face. The Osireion was officially attributed to Seti based primarily on inscriptions found in an outer corridor section of the structure. Those inscriptions, which include the text of the Book of Gates and scenes from the Amduat, both standard New Kingdom funerary texts, are clearly New Kingdom in style and content. There is no serious dispute about that. Seti's name is there. Seti's imagery is there. But here is what the inscriptions cannot explain. The core structure, the massive granite hall, the central island platform, the surrounding water channel, none of that looks like New Kingdom architecture. None of it, not even slightly. New Kingdom Egyptian architecture, the period of Ramesses and Seti and Tutankhamun and Akhenaten, is characterized by decorated walls, soaring columns, intricate relief carvings, and an aesthetic vocabulary that is immediately recognizable to anyone who has spent time looking at Egyptian temples. It is grand, it is ornate, and it is covered in text. The Egyptians of the New Kingdom did not build plain, bare granite chambers. They simply did not. What the core of the Osireion looks like is something much older. The undecorated megalithic style, the massive undressed blocks, the emphasis on sheer scale over ornamentation. This aesthetic belongs to the Old Kingdom at the earliest, and arguably to something even older than that, pre-dynastic, before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before, as far as we can tell, Egyptian civilization had developed the organizational capacity to move 100-ton blocks of granite from Aswan to Abydos. The Egyptologist E. A. Wallace Budge, who examined the Osireion in the early 20th century, noted this stylistic inconsistency and described the structure as belonging to a tradition older than any known Egyptian building. And Wallace Budge was not a fringe theorist. He was the keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum. When he says something does not fit, that carries weight. Pun absolutely intended, given that we are talking about 100-ton blocks. The conventional explanation is that Seti deliberately built his memorial temple in an archaic style to evoke antiquity, to make his monument look ancient as a kind of theological statement connecting himself to the oldest roots of Egyptian religion. This is possible. Ancient cultures absolutely did engage in deliberate archaism. We know this. But deliberately building in an archaic style does not explain the scale of the blocks. It does not explain the depth of the structure. And it does not explain the weathering. The water mystery. Let us spend a moment on the water, because the water is not a side. Detail. The water is one of the most important clues this structure has to offer, and most people who visit the Osireion glance at it, take a photograph, and completely miss what they are looking at. The structure is flooded. Not occasionally, not seasonally, permanently. It has been flooded for as long as modern researchers have studied it. When Margaret Murray and her team first excavated it in 1914, they pumped water out continuously just to access the interior. The moment they stopped pumping, the water came back. When researchers visited in the 1980s, it was full. When visitors go today, it is full. Clear, still, greenish water sitting in the channel that surrounds the central granite platform, with lotus plants growing straight up from it like the whole thing was landscaped on purpose. And honestly, it might have been, which is either a profound architectural statement or the most inconvenient building design in human history. Possibly both. The mainstream interpretation connects this to none, the Egyptian concept of the primordial waters of creation, the formless, infinite ocean that existed before the gods shaped reality, before land, before sky, before light, just water and darkness and potential. In Egyptian cosmology, the first act of creation was the emergence of a mound of earth from those primordial waters. The first solid ground, the axis around which existence organized itself. The island platform at the center of the Osireion, rising from the surrounding water channel, would represent exactly that, the mound of creation, the first moment of existence made permanent in granite. And the Osiris connection reinforces this reading, because the myth of Osiris, killed by his brother Set, dismembered, then resurrected by Isis, is fundamentally a story about death and renewal, about something disappearing beneath the water and coming back. The symbolism is not subtle. It is deliberate, layered, and coherent. This is not a fringe interpretation. This is the standard Egyptological reading, supported by substantial textual evidence from Egyptian religious literature spanning centuries. The symbolism is real. But here is the problem that the symbolism cannot solve. A permanently flooded structure is a structure you cannot functionally use for almost anything. You cannot store sacred texts in it. Papyrus and water do not have a great relationship. You cannot hold regular religious ceremonies in it without everyone getting wet, which I imagine dampens the spiritual atmosphere somewhat. You cannot perform a burial in it, because submerging a body in standing groundwater is not Egyptian funerary practice by any known tradition. You cannot use it as a workshop, a meeting hall, a storage facility, or any of the other practical functions ancient buildings typically served. So if it was not for any of those things, what was it for? Why go to the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible effort of constructing a 100-ton granite chamber 9 meters underground in a location guaranteed to flood, if the flooding itself makes the space unusable by any normal measure? The answer to that question is one of the most fascinating and most contested debates in the study of ancient Egypt. Hold the water in your mind. We are coming back to it. What conventional archaeology says. To be fair, and I genuinely mean that because I think intellectual honesty matters here, mainstream Egyptology has a coherent position on the Osireion. It is not a position built on nothing. It has real evidence behind it. And it deserves to be laid out clearly before we start pulling at the threads, because the threads are worth pulling precisely because the argument seems so reasonable on the surface. The official view goes like this. Seti I, who reigned from approximately 1390 to 1279 BCE, commissioned the Osireion as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb, not a place where Seti was actually buried. His real tomb is in the Valley of the Kings, and it is spectacular. But this was a ritual structure connected to the cult of Osiris at Abydos. And Abydos was not just any religious site. It was considered the most sacred location in all of Egypt, the place where Osiris himself was believed to be buried, where his head or his body or some essential part of him, depending on which version of the myth you follow, was said to rest in the earth. Building a monument at Abydos was not merely a religious act. It was a political statement of the highest order. It was a pharaoh saying, "I am connected to the oldest and most sacred tradition in Egyptian religion. I belong in this lineage. I am part of this story." Seti built his magnificent memorial temple on the surface, covered it in some of the finest relief carvings Egypt ever produced, and then constructed the Osireion beside it as a symbolic underworld counterpart, deliberately sunken into the earth, deliberately flooded, deliberately evoking the mythology of death, the primordial waters, and the resurrection of Osiris. The evidence for this attribution starts with the inscriptions. Seti's name appears in the structure. The texts on the walls of the outer corridor include the Book of Gates and the Amduat, both standard New Kingdom funerary compositions, rendered in a style entirely consistent with Seti's reign. The location, directly adjacent to his temple, supports the connection, and the theological design of the whole complex, temple on the surface, symbolic underworld below, Osiris resurrection mythology threading through both, gives the conventional story a genuine internal logic that serious scholars find compelling. This is a reasonable argument. It is not a desperate argument. There are careful, rigorous Egyptologists who find it entirely satisfactory and who would tell you, politely but firmly, that the alternative theories say more about our appetite for mystery than about the actual evidence. But here is where the cracks begin to show. And I want you to notice exactly where the crack is, because it is specific. The inscriptions bearing Seti's name are confined entirely to the outer corridor section of the structure. The core granite hall, the massive megalithic 100-ton block interior, contains no inscriptions attributing it to Seti, no cartouches, no dedications, no builder's marks of any kind. Nothing. And that matters enormously, because it is entirely consistent with a different explanation. Not that Seti built the Osireion, but that Seti found it, added a decorated corridor to the entrance, inscribed his name, and effectively claimed something that was already ancient. This would not be remotely unusual behavior for an Egyptian pharaoh. Egyptian history is saturated with kings who attach their cartouches to older monuments and absorb the credit. Scholars have described this practice with considerable diplomatic restraint over the years. Less diplomatically, ancient pharaohs were absolutely not above historical graffiti. And if the most powerful men in the ancient world were doing it, you can be sure they were doing it with a straight face and a full priesthood backing them up. Seti's name being in the Osireion proves Seti was connected to the Osireion. It does not prove Seti built it. The timeline doesn't add up. And now we arrive at what I think is the most significant and most carefully avoided piece of evidence in this entire debate: the weathering. In 1991, the geologist Robert Schoch made international headlines when he published research arguing that the weathering patterns on the Great Sphinx of Giza were inconsistent with wind erosion, the type of weathering you would expect from a structure that has sat in the desert since around 2500 BCE, and were instead consistent with heavy rainfall erosion. The kind of erosion that would require centuries of exposure to significant precipitation. The last time the Giza Plateau received that kind of rainfall was during the African humid period, which ended somewhere between 5000 and 7000 BCE, which would push the Sphinx's origins back to before conventional Egyptian civilization begins. Schoch's argument remains controversial. Many mainstream Egyptologists reject it, but the geological evidence has never been fully dismissed, and several independent geologists have reviewed Schoch's methodology and found it credible. Now, here is why this matters for the Osireion. Schoch himself, along with other researchers, has examined the weathering patterns on the Osireion and found them similarly anomalous. The erosion profile on the upper portions of the structure, the parts that were exposed before being buried by sand accumulation, shows characteristics more consistent with prolonged water weathering than with the dry desert conditions that have prevailed in the region for the past several thousand years. In other words, the Osireion appears to have experienced significant water erosion on its upper surfaces during a period when Abydos received substantially more rainfall than it does today. The last time that would have been true, and this is the part that tends to make conventional archaeologists deeply uncomfortable, was before approximately 5000 BCE. If that weathering evidence is valid, the Osireion is not a new kingdom structure. It is not even an old kingdom structure. It predates the dynastic period entirely. It was built, or at least its core was built, by people who lived in a wetter, earlier Egypt thousands of years before the pharaohs, before the hieroglyphs, before the civilization we call ancient Egypt had come into existence. I want to be clear, this is contested. The weathering argument is not accepted by the mainstream. There are geologists who argue the erosion patterns can be explained without requiring an older date. This is a live debate, not a settled conclusion. But here is what makes the weathering evidence particularly hard to dismiss in the case of the Osireion specifically. Unlike the Sphinx debate, where the entire argument rests on one structure, the Osireion's anomalies are multiple and independent. The stylistic mismatch is real. The construction scale is genuinely difficult to explain within the New Kingdom timeline. The depth and the flooding are architecturally bizarre for the period. And now the weathering adds a fourth data point pointing in the same direction. When four separate lines of evidence all point toward the same uncomfortable conclusion, the conventional explanation starts to require more and more special pleading to survive. What was it actually for? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the Osireion is genuinely old, pre-dynastic old, built by a culture that existed in the Nile Valley before the pharaohs, before the priests, before anyone we have named or dated or cataloged. What on earth was it for? The Osiris connection is almost certainly real, but it may be older than the Osiris myth as we know it. Scholars of comparative mythology have long noted that the Osiris myth, death, dismemberment, resurrection, appears to be one of the oldest narrative structures in human religious thought. It predates the Egyptian texts that first record it. The myth may have been attached to this structure by later Egyptians who encountered something ancient and mysterious and interpreted it through their existing theological framework. In the same way that medieval Europeans built churches on top of pre-Christian sacred sites and simply reassigned the sanctity rather than trying to understand it, the New Kingdom Egyptians may have found the Osireion already ancient and already flooded and already half-buried, and said, "This is clearly a sacred place. This is obviously connected to Osiris. Let us put some inscriptions here and claim it." The most compelling functional theory, and I want to be careful to present this as a theory rather than a conclusion, is that the Osireion was a resurrection chamber. not metaphorically, physically. A place where initiates underwent ritual, death and rebirth as part of a religious ceremony. The subterranean location, the surrounding water, the island platform, the darkness. All of these could have been elements of an initiation ritual designed to be overwhelming to the human nervous system, to simulate death and emergence, to produce, through architectural experience, the psychological and spiritual impact of resurrection. Ancient mystery traditions across cultures, Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, involved initiation ceremonies that required the candidate to symbolically die and be reborn. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece involved underground chambers and carefully staged experiences designed to transform the initiate permanently. The architecture of transformation. If the Osireion was built for something like this, then its design underground, flooded, isolated, stripped of all decoration, reducing the experience to pure raw stone and water and darkness, makes a terrible, magnificent kind of sense. The implications. Here is the part where I have to ask you to follow the logic to its conclusion, even though the conclusion is uncomfortable. If the Osireion predates dynastic Egypt, then we have physical proof of a sophisticated construction culture in the Nile Valley thousands of years before the civilization we call ancient Egypt emerged. A culture capable of quarrying and transporting 100-ton blocks of granite across hundreds of kilometers. A culture with the mathematical and engineering knowledge to place those blocks with millimeter precision. A culture with enough understanding of hydrology and water management to deliberately construct a flooded subterranean chamber and keep it functional. That is not a primitive culture. That is not a proto-civilization fumbling toward complexity. That is a sophisticated, organized, technically capable society that somehow left almost no trace except this building and a handful of other anomalous structures scattered across Egypt and the wider ancient world. What happened to them? We do not know. The geological record suggests that the African humid period ended with dramatic climate change around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. The Sahara dried out. The Nile Valley ecosystem was transformed. Populations that had been distributed across a wetter, greener North Africa were compressed and displaced. A culture adapted to one climate might not survive the transition to another. Or it might survive, but be so transformed by the crisis that its descendants looked nothing like their ancestors. What the dynastic Egyptians may have inherited was not the knowledge of how to build the Osireion. They may have inherited only the memory that it existed, and the myth that explained it. The monument itself, half buried and flooded, a relic of something they no longer understood, folded into their theology as the tomb of Osiris, because that was the most meaningful way they had to describe a sacred place so ancient that even they did not know who built it. That is a story that should make you sit quietly for a moment. The ancient Egyptians, who we consider the ancient world, were themselves standing in the ruins of something older, something they had already lost, already mythologized, already begun to forget. History is longer and stranger than we were taught. So where does this leave us? The Osireion remains officially attributed to Seti. Mainstream archaeology has not changed its position. The inscriptions, the location, the theological coherence of the Osiris attribution. These are real pieces of evidence, and they are not nothing. But the construction anomalies are real. The stylistic mismatch is real. The weathering questions are real. The depth problem is real. And taken together, they form a picture that the conventional timeline struggles to accommodate honestly. Jeremy Wade, in talking about the end of River Monsters, described the experience of returning to a place he had filmed years earlier and finding it dead. He wept not just for what was lost, but for all the times he had presented a partial truth as a complete one. I think about that when I think about the Osireion, because for over a century we have been given a partial truth about this structure. Seti built it. New Kingdom. 1300 BCE. Mystery solved. But the stones say something different. The weathering says something different. The engineering says something different. And at some point, the partial truth stops being good enough. The Osireion is still there, partially flooded, half buried, sitting 9 meters below the sand at Abydos, older than anyone officially admits, and stranger than most people know. The water is still rising in it every year. The lotus plants are still growing from it. The granite is still fitted with a precision that modern engineers look at and go quiet. Whatever it is, whoever built it, it was built to last. And it has. That is the Osireion. That is the mystery nobody is in a hurry to solve. If this episode changed how you think about the ancient world, share it with someone who needs their assumptions rattled. Subscribe to Reef Discovery, and I will see you in the next one, where we will find something else that should not exist and talk about it anyway.